Hola, Econ peeps. This is the penultimate module. It is the first in a two-module sequence that discusses the global economy. International economics is a course in its own right, so we're just barely going to scratch the surface. So today we're going to talk about trade, and then on the next module we're going to talk about foreign exchange. Now remember that fiscal policy primarily affects consumer spending and government spending. That's how output is affected. That's how aggregate demand gets affected. Monetary policy primarily affects business spending. Now, there's some overlap there to be sure. Quite a bit, really, if you could argue. If you change tax rates for businesses, that would obviously affect business spending. If you change interest rates, that can affect consumer spending because a higher rate of interest incentivizes savings, and if consumers are saving their money, they're not spending their money, right? But nonetheless, fiscal policy affects consumer spending, government spending primarily. Monetary policy affects business spending primarily. There's three of my four components of output and aggregate demand. So that leaves us with net exports. What affects net exports? Foreign exchange. Every single transaction that occurs between people in different countries requires an exchange of currency. We will talk about that more in the next module. Today we're going to be talking about trade. Okay? Now, for what it's worth, which isn't much, I'm not sure, but two things. Trade is one of the few areas in economics that there is widespread agreement among economists. And that agreement is that it is, on average, good for the economy. That trade is a positive, a net positive. The second thing is I no longer find myself in that camp. My problem with trade, I don't have a problem with free trade. I would love to have free trade. My problem is free trade doesn't really exist. There is no such thing as free trade with countries that do not have our labor and market regulations. It's just not. It's not free trade at all. Costs are quite extensive, and we're going to talk about some of that today. Okay, and you can kind of see where I come down on this. Anyway, so they tend to conflate globalization and trade as kind of the same thing, or at least that there's some relationship between them. I think globalization has become more of a sort of watchword for global governance, right? And I have to tell you, that's another area that concerns me. Listen, I've said this before. Early in the semester, I mentioned that I think the reason why, and you're free to disagree and share with me why you disagree, but I believe one of the reasons why capitalism has been effective, and it has, there's just no arguing that. It has been effective. You could argue something else could have been more effective, but it has been effective. And one of the reasons is because it allows people to pursue their own self-interest, to do what they want. Okay? Now, I'm a firm believer that this world will be a much better place when all the countries are free to pursue what's in their own best interest. Because I'm sorry, what's in the best interest of some of these other countries is not in our best interest. And I think that presents all sorts of problems. And that's the problem I have with global governance. The notion that there is one way we all must go forward is absurd on its face. Setting aside the fact that China's not going to agree with that. Russia's not going to agree with that. Iran's not going to agree with that. And they're probably going to be laughing in our face as they continue to move towards global domination, which is what China wants. They don't even pretend that's not it. They will openly admit they are determined to dominate the globe. They want the whole world for themselves, and they freely admit that. And that means first and foremost toppling the U.S. And so everything they do is about getting on top of the U.S., becoming a greater economic force in this world than the U.S., and then they can completely render us pretty feckless. Not that we haven't done a pretty good job all on our own, but So I'm not a big fan of this idea of globalization, but nonetheless, it's fair to suggest that trading has certainly led to increased globalization. How's that? So some of the questions we're going to talk about today is what are the gains from trade? What are the are there ways we can protect ourselves from some of the costs associated with trade, and what are those costs? Um, so we'll explore that. Okay. Now, it's important to understand that there are two different types of advantage that a nation can claim in the trade process, right? So when a country is said to have an absolute advantage when it can produce a resource at a lower resource cost than another country. It has an absolute advantage in the production of a good if it can do so, if it can produce that good at a lower resource cost. Resource, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Okay? So their example here, if Canada can produce 100 pounds of beef using 2 ranchers, but it takes Argentina 3 ranchers to produce the same amount of beef, Canada has a clear absolute advantage. In other words, it takes fewer units of labor, ranchers in this case, to produce the same amount of beef. Okay? It's important to understand that that a country can have absolute advantage in the production of both goods. In fact, it's quite common, particularly for higher income countries like the U.S. We have an absolute advantage in the production of almost everything. Okay? Absolute advantage doesn't tell us much. It really doesn't help all that much. The one we want is something called comparative advantage. Let me rephrase that. The one we want to know about is comparative advantage, right? A country is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of a good or service when it can produce that good or service at a lower opportunity cost. In other words, you're looking at 2 goods. I'm going to trade with this country for one, and they're going to trade with me for the other, and right? That's the whole idea. So we're looking at 2 goods. Well, we have limited resources, right? So however much of this good over here I produce, however much I'm producing of this good, those resources being used to produce that good are no longer available to produce this good. So for every unit of that good, I'm having to give up some of that unit, and vice versa. Hence the name opportunity cost, right? So the question that these countries ask is, what do we give up to produce this good? All right? So if Zambia is producing copper, it has fewer resources it can use to produce, say, corn. And so they're giving up some amount of corn production for the sake of copper production. Right? Suppose it takes 10 hours of labor to mine a ton of copper in Zambia and 20 hours of labor to harvest a bushel of corn. So the way they do this is really absurd. And I'll show you what I mean with this next couple of slides. So if Ryan, interesting spelling, if Ryan can make more tacos in an hour than Suzanne, but Suzanne can make more tacos at a lower opportunity cost, then it can be said that Suzanne has a comparative advantage in making tacos. Doesn't have an absolute advantage, Ryan does. In the same amount of time, there's your resource. In less time, Ryan can make more. Right? Ryan can make more in a single hour than Suzanne can. That means they have an absolute advantage. All right. So again, higher income countries, better off countries, is that an appropriate phrase, tend to have an advantage in all goods. Okay? So here's their thing. And again, they did this in input form. You're going to get one of 2 things when it comes to this kind of analysis about who has comparative advantage. This one here is a table, and it is in an input format, meaning that you're inputting units of labor for the same amount of output. I don't like that. I want output. Sometimes you can do it in a table like this, and here's how I frequently see it. Here it is in a graph. In this case, the United States is producing beef and vegetables, and here's Mexico's beef and vegetable production. All right? And these are just production possibility curves, nice and linear, so it makes the analysis much simpler, not like the real world, but this is doable. All right? But we can work with this. I'm going to convert this to output. Okay? And the way I'm going to do that is if the United States can produce 1,000 units of shoes with 4 workers, how many units of shoes can a single worker produce? 250. So the output of one worker in the U.S. when it comes to shoes is 250, according to this information. For Mexico, it's 200 units of shoes. Okay. Fridge production. The United States can produce 1,000 units with a single unit. How much can Mexico make with a single unit? Well, 4 workers make 1,000. So 1 worker would make 250. All right? So I have taken the data they provided me in an input format, and I have turned it into output. At the top is a graph that shows, it's hard to tell, but this right here says 1,000. So this is a graph with shoes on the vertical axis and fridge on the horizontal. Same over here, and this is Mexico's production. And then I've created a table. All right? Now, to find comparative advantage, we have to figure out what are they giving up to produce one of those goods. So for America, they are giving up 250 units of shoes to make 1,000 units of fridge. Remember, this is a production possibility curve. They can produce 1,000 units of refrigerators, but that means they don't have any resources left to go towards shoe production. Similarly, they can produce 250 units of shoes, but they don't have anything left over to produce refrigerators. All right? So, that's how we're going to do this. So bear with me. All right? Let me keep that one here and get another piece of paper, and we're going to do some... Sorry, I have to drop the M-bomb. We're going to do some math. All right. So, for U.S., Mexico, and shoes and fridge. All right. So all I've done is create a little table here for me. And now I'm going to do some math. We know that the U.S., we know from this chart right here, that it's giving up 250 units for 1,000 refrigerators. It's giving up 250 units of shoes to produce 1,000 units of refrigerators. All right? It's giving up it's given up 250 pairs of shoes for every 1,000 refrigerators that it makes. That doesn't help me. I need to know how much is it given up for a single refrigerator. The U.S. is giving up 250 units. If I put this behind it, yeah, you can kind of see. It's given up 250 units of shoes for every 1,000 units of refrigerators. How many is it given up for a single fridge? On a per fridge basis, what is the opportunity cost of producing refrigerators? Well, it is 1/4 of a shoe, right? So the opportunity cost for the U.S. to produce a fridge is 1/4 of a shoe. I know that don't make sense, but it doesn't matter. We're just for one. We're going to normalize all of these. Bear with me. For Mexico, right? Mexico is giving up 200 units of shoes to make 250 refrigerators. Mexico is giving up 200 pairs of shoes just to make 250 fridge. I need to know how much are they giving up to make one. And I set it up this way on purpose so that my x is over 1 because that's just x. And then I can reduce, right? 20 over 25, both are divided by 4. That looks like what? 4/5? 20 over 25 would be 4/5, right? So for Mexico, their opportunity cost is 4/5 of a shoe. All right? The U.S. is giving up a quarter of a shoe for every fridge they produce, whereas Mexico's giving up 4/5 of a shoe for every fridge it's producing. All right? Now we're going to do the same calculation for shoes. Done. Wow, that was fast, huh? Notice that it's just the inverse reciprocal. Right? I shouldn't say inverse, just the reciprocal. All right? Because in other words, all we're saying here, now we're saying that to make a refrigerator, they're giving up 1,000, I should say to make a shoe, they're giving up 1,000, to make 250 pair of shoes, the U.S. has to give up 1,000 refrigerators. We know that. Right? We know that, sorry, I'm getting a mess here. We know that the U.S. is going to have to give up 1,000 refrigerators for every 250 shoes it produces. Units of shoes. Right? How many are they giving up? For one. I'll put a box around it there. Right? All I did was reduce that. All I did was plug it in. What are they giving up to produce 250? I need to know what they're giving up to produce one. They give up 4. It's just the reciprocal of the other one, right? Same with Mexico. Now we need to identify who has the lowest opportunity cost in production of each good. Because of that inverse, because how those things get reversed, the same country cannot have a comparative advantage. It is literally mathematically impossible for the same country to have a comparative advantage in the production of a good. So, when it comes to shoe, which number is smaller? All right, 5/4 is the same as 1 1/4. So it looks to me that Mexico has a much smaller opportunity cost in the production of shoes. So Mexico has a comparative advantage in the production of shoes. That automatically, if the math didn't work out this way, then you did something wrong. Notice that for refrigerator productions, the U.S. has a much smaller, this is 4/5. 4/5 is much larger than 1/4, right? If you were to do the math, this would be 0.8, this is 0.25. 0.25 is smaller than 0.8. So, the U.S. has a comparative advantage in the production, trying to get it centered on the screen there, in the production of refrigerators. What does this mean? This means that when it comes to terms of trade, we already established one thing. Mexico is going to focus all of their production on shoes, and they're not going to make any refrigerators. U.S., on the other hand, is going to focus all of its production on refrigerators and not produce any shoes. And then we will trade for the one good that we're not producing anymore. See how that works? It's called specialization. Because we have a lower opportunity cost in the production of refrigerators, we're going to specialize in the production of refrigerators. Now, you need to seek out opportunities to practice that math. There are other videos out there too. I wish I could spend more time. You're happy to feel free to schedule some Zoom time and I can go over this with you some more. But there's a chance that you're going to see something similar to that on your test, right? So be prepared for that. All right? And anytime they give you the numbers in input, in other words, it takes this many workers to produce the same amount of output, you need to know how much output can each unit of input produce. And so we converted this to output so that we can easily see what they're having to give up. Right? Anyway, there's my spiel on comparative advantage. All right? Here's their setup. In this case, they can produce 10,000 shoes, but in order to do so, they have to give up 40,000 refrigerators. Of course, if they were on their own and they weren't trading with Mexico, they wouldn't be doing just shoes and no fridges. They would be doing one or the other. But they're giving up 40,000 refrigerators for 10,000 shoes. How many are they giving up for a single pair of shoes? 4 refrigerators. For every shoe they make, for every bit of the resources they have to put, for every labor they put towards production of shoes, they're having to give up 4 refrigerators for that. Right? That's a pretty steep one. In the case of Mexico, it's 5/4. Quite a bit lower. Right? So here's their breakdown. I hadn't seen this, and here it is in output. I agree that you want to definitely try to put it in output. I think it's much more intuitive in terms of output, but that's me. Okay. All right. So that is available to you on the course page. You can download these slides there. And read through that. I've shown you my process. That's theirs. Certainly worth a gander. But let's move forward. There I want to talk about, that's not a bad point, but I'm not gonna question that on the test or nothing. Intra-industry trade. They're saying most of the trade of goods occurs within the same industry. Yeah, and there's that specialization, right? As I said. So forgive me, but I'm gonna move through some of this. There's definitely advantages to economies of scale. It means as output goes up, average cost, in other words, cost per unit comes down. That's economies of scale. You want that. That's one of the reasons why Walmart is so successful, because they've got so many stores out there that they can almost always reduce cost because they're selling so many more. They're buying so many more to put on their shelves. There's so many shelves around the world where that particular good can be sold at Walmart. Right? And that's how they achieve economies of scale. We've talked a little bit about that. We will not be doing supply and demand analysis doing this. You can. I'll save that for intermediate macro if any of you end up taking that. Okay. But we'll talk a little bit about protectionism. Globalization has not brought fear of loss of jobs and loss of incomes. It's brought loss of jobs and loss of income. Right? That's not what's described as a race to the bottom. It's just not. That's silly. Loss of culture, okay. Many countries worry about their cultures being overwhelmed by that of the United States. That's what we call irony. When a government legislates policies to reduce or block international trade, that's protectionism. And the goal in those cases is to shield domestic producers and workers from foreign competition. Okay? So tariffs is the most common example of a protectionistic policy, of a policy of protectionism. Right? And a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Right? But you can also do something called import quotas. Import quotas are numerical limitations on the quantity that a country can import. You're going to say you can only import so much. And then there are non-tariff barriers, other ways, rules and regulations, inspections, paperwork, make it too costly to import. I will tell you that tariffs are the most popular way. There's good reason for that. It's a source of income for countries. It's hard to justify getting rid of a tariff when it's bringing in revenue for the country. Import quotas does not bring them in any money. Non-tariff barriers doesn't bring them in as much money. Right? Tariffs is a source of revenue for these countries. Taxes on imported goods is a source of revenue. Hard to justify getting rid of some of that. Right? The common belief among economists is that it is better to embrace the gains from trade and then deal with the cost and trade-off with other policy tools instead of no trade at all. I think, generally speaking, that is true. But again, I have huge concerns about how we trade. They've made deals that have hurt the U.S. worker, and I don't think that's good for this country. I don't think that's good for this country. Has it resulted in less expensive goods across the board? Arguably it has, but a fat lot of good that does to the steel worker in Ohio who doesn't have a job and is now strung out on fentanyl or whatever else we're importing into this country. Okay? I didn't invent this issue, right? Detroit, Michigan used to be a thriving metropolis, smack dab in the middle of the Rust Belt. Population of almost 2 million people. And now it's barely got 500,000 people. And there are huge chunks of the nation, of the city that has been abandoned. There's just nobody living there. This isn't some third world country. This is right here in the US of A. All of these homes, all of these businesses. Here's a nice theater, garage, it looks like, of some sort. Right? Here's a cathedral, or what used to be an old museum. I don't know. Right? Here's a abandoned church. Here's some companies that no longer exist. Here's some industrial areas that have been abandoned, that are in complete disrepair. There's a huge, that looks like an office building of some sort that was packed and busy with people working and making a living there at some point. Right? There's another one. Huge chunks of Detroit now abandoned, gone, never to return. Trade did that. I don't care what they say. That was trade. And you know what it did? It took all these people's jobs and left in its wake little more than an opioid crisis. That's my problem with it. So they made it up by retraining these workers for other jobs, which, by the way, they then promptly sent back overseas as well. So how many times are you going to retrain the same people? How many times are you going to take their job? Listen, productivity is essential to the human condition. Human beings need to be productive. In the absence of productivity, their self-worth will suffer. And you know what happens when self-worth suffers? That's when addiction can set in. All right? That's when you have problems with addiction. And this happened. All right? It's not my fault. I'm not making this up. This happened. These are real places in just one city that has been adversely affected by so-called free trade. Does this look free to you? Does this look like trade that was free? It looks like it came at an extraordinary cost to us. Looks to me like it came at an extraordinary cost to us. Again, feel free to email me. Tell me why I'm wrong, why you disagree. I'm happy to entertain your thoughts, and in fact, I would love to hear from you. I'm just saying. That's my problem with trade. I'm not saying that it doesn't have benefits. I'm just suggesting that we might want to reevaluate whether the benefits truly outweigh the cost. And unfortunately, there's not many economists who want to do that. Right? It is not free. There's nothing free about trading with first and second world countries. Nothing. All right? Take Mexico, for example. We trade with them a lot. In fact, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, don't we? NAFTA, which we're probably going to be talking about soon. Right? North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, it's not true that Mexico does not have a minimum wage. They do. Their minimum wage is, depending on how close to the border, it's $5 in most places around Mexico, and I believe it's as high as $7 as you get closer to the border. $7 a day. $5 a day most everywhere else. A day. Now you tell me how American workers are supposed to be able to compete with that. There's no requirement to provide their health care. By the way, that's the single most expensive cost to the employer for hiring you. Cost them a lot to give you health insurance. So when they're all whining about how wages have remained stagnant, you know what hasn't remained stagnant? The cost to the employer of paying for all the benefits that you get outside of that. Some of you don't have those. I get that. It's not everybody else's fault that you don't have the skills and the knowledge to go and find a job that does pay those benefits. That's not everybody else's fault. If I'm wrong, send me an email. Tell me what it is that other people did that precluded you from developing a skill or accruing the knowledge that would have allowed you to get a job that did pay better, that did have more benefits. Tell me how it is that everybody else did that to you. The rest of society now somehow owes it to you to provide you with free stuff because you weren't able, you were unable to, you were precluded from being successful on your own. Let me know. All right. So trading with Mexico is anything but free. So the North America Free Trade Agreement, nothing free about it. It has come at a huge cost to the U.S. And they knew when they did it, it would. They knew it would. I was alive and well when this debate went on. This was in the early 90s. I turned 20 in 1988. So I was in my 20s through most of the 90s. So I wasn't politically active like I am today, arguably, but I was certainly aware. Partly because there was a third-party candidate running in 1992 when I was 24, by the name of H. Ross Perot, who's a Dallas businessman. He passed away not too long ago. but he was a third-party candidate. He ran as neither Republican nor Democrat. Arguably the single most successful third-party candidacy for the White House in the history of the U.S. We'll talk about that in a moment. All right. I'm not suggesting that their analysis is void of these costs associated with it. I get that when they analyze it, they see free trade as disruptive, and there are trade-offs. They just think that the trade-offs are worth it. I absolutely do not. I absolutely do not. It is not worth the trade-offs when you are trading with first and second world countries that have nowhere near the regulations or the costs associated with production that we do here in the U.S. One or the other has to go. Either we have to get rid of our regulations, or we can't be doing that, in my estimation. It's not right. There's nothing free or fair about that trade arrangement. Nothing. Disruptive market change happens anytime innovative new product. This isn't an innovative new product or a production technology disrupting the status quo. This is policy saying, oh, I got an idea. Let's screw the American worker and not care. That's not innovation. All right. We all benefit from living in an economy where people and firms can specialize in trade. I'm not saying that we haven't benefited as well, right? We certainly have. Again, I'm not sure those benefits outweigh the costs. All right. So reducing barriers to trade. Well, this is funny. We started something called the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, or GATT, in the 40s. The United Nations, lovely organization that is utterly feckless and worthless, generally speaking, and cost a bloody fortune. And in the 90s, it was transformed into something called the World Trade Organization. But their goal is to reduce barriers to trade, and they are largely feckless and have no capacity to really affect anything. They don't have jurisdiction in other people's. They don't have any in other people's sovereignty. They can't go into other countries and enforce GATT. They can do whatever they want. Now they can kick them out of the World Trade Organization, but they never do. China doesn't abide by these rules, and there is a process in place where you can complain. You can file a grievance, if you will. We have trade disagreements that have been on the books now for almost 2 decades and still have not reached a reasonable conclusion. By the time they're finally resolved, it's irrelevant. It's a silly, ridiculous outfit that serves no real palpable purpose except, again, to push one world governance, in my opinion. So here's some list of some of the things they've done, right? They're committed to lowering barriers to trade, but have no authority to actually do so. None. That's a heck of a commitment there. I'm not saying there aren't plenty of countries that would love to reduce tariffs, right? So economic integration around the globe, free trade agreements, common markets, and economic unions like the European Union. Certainly the European Union is well known regional trading agreement. They formed that, but that has turned into now basically everybody in the EU is being governed by a central organization in, where's the EU headquarters? Brussels, I believe. So, and that's one of the reasons why Britain voted to exit the European Union. And they were smart. When they entered the European Union, they didn't get rid of their currency. Almost every other country, I think every other country did, abandon their currency and start using the euro, which was fine. They still had some of theirs around. It's not like you couldn't take it forever, immediately, but there was a transition. But in England, they kept the pound and the sterling. It was still very much being used in transactions, along with the euro, right? But for the United States, their best known regional trading agreement is the North American Free Trade Agreement. All right? North American Free Trade Agreement was being negotiated in the early 90s. President George H.W. Bush, President Bush's father, was in the White House at that time. As I said, they knew when they did this, when they did the North American Free Trade Agreement, excuse me for a second, pause that. YouTube is one of the clunkiest for all their, as I said, they knew when they signed up and started advocating for this North American Free Trade Agreement They knew what it would do. They knew it would hurt America's workforce. They knew it. How do I know they knew it? Because a man stood on arguably the biggest stage in the world and told everybody they would. In 1992, H. Ross Perot, Dallas businessman, ran for president. And listen to what he says.
You can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25. That's assuming you've been in business for a long time. You've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor. Have no health care. That's the most expensive single element in making a car. Have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement. And you don't care about anything but making money. There will be a giant sucking sound going south. So
Who are those two people? That is President George H.W. Bush. That was the man who ended up winning this election in 1992. President William Jefferson Clinton. Surprised I know that. Bill Clinton. All right. So on arguably the biggest stage in the world, running against two of the most powerful people in the world for the office that one holds, the other one's about to hold. And he tells them to their face, that's what's going to happen. He's a businessman. He knows this. He knows it. They did it anyway. I didn't agree. I didn't know much enough to know whether NAFTA was good or bad. I just remember that was going on at the time. All right. So, anyway, folks, that's my spiel about trade and why I have real concerns with it. I hope I wasn't too bombastic. And so there's our chapter, module 14 conclusion. Folks, have a wonderful day. I'll see you back here for our last lecture of the semester, module 15, where we will talk about foreign exchange. Thanks, everyone. Be safe. Be kind. Thank you all.